dragon variation of approaches to dragon, which were used at the very beginning, at the very origin of the variation. So we're going to take a look at two games by 𝐃𝐫𝐚 with interesting sacrifices and amazing tactical complexities. Then we're going to go ahead and take a look at Karpov Korchnoi, a legendary game where Karpov executed the attack flawlessly. This game would indicate for us what are the dangers for black to be playing dragon variation and what kind of opportunities there exist for white that black has to face and counter. And then finally we're gonna get to the competitive side of dragon variation, taking a look at the modern giants of dragon variation, Carlsen, Radjabov, and Karjakin matching each other. So here, move number 2, black goes for d6. You guys, I'm sure, familiar with this Sicilian setup. And here, if black wants to go for accelerated dragon, here she would pick g6, and after d4, c takes d, knight d4, and knight c6. White has several options, including Marozzi-Bind's system. So here, and as well as queen d4. Okay, so for you guys out there who want to play the main line or the more aggressive, more challenging line of dragon, starting with d6, you would pick this particular move order where white goes ahead and plays d4, c takes d, knight d4, knight f6, knight c3, defending the pawn on e4, very natural development, and here black goes ahead and plays g6. Bishop e3. Now, the idea of bishop e3 is to, well, number one, develop the piece. It's put it on a good spot, and you may ask, why not play knight g4, challenging the bishop right there? And turns out it's a bad move, which almost loses the game. After bishop b5, bishop d7, queen takes g4, and black is down a piece. Now, if black counters with knight c6, knight c6, b takes c, he loses an exchange right there on a8. So black is not ready for knight g4. Black goes bishop g7, and here white really wants to play queen d2 and potentially get the bishop to h6 and continue on the attack via h4, h5. If white goes ahead and plays queen d2, black is going to continue knight g4. Now white really wants to remove that bishop, because if black is going to capture the bishop, let's say after white castles, then this bishop right here on g7 is going to have no opponent, no one to stop this bishop from dominating this diagonal and creating a powerful, or assisting in creating a powerful attack. So here, let's say after knight g4, white goes ahead and continues bishop b5, making a check. Well, this doesn't really help quite as much. Bishop d7. Now let's say white prefers to remove the bishop. Bishop f4 is going to run into e5. So bishop g5, and after h6, bishop h4, knight c6. Black is going to be putting a lot of pressure right here, and if bishop or knight captures that knight on c6, pawn is going to take, and black is additionally going to gain this file for attack. So here, this is not favorable way for white to play, and the main line goes ahead and secures this square on g4, and as well as protects the pawn on e4. So black castles, and here there's two options, one of which is queen d2, the major way for white to continue in this position. Now when the dragon variation was just starting, we can examine knight b3. So this is a double-edged move with more disadvantages rather than advantages, since the knight goes to a mediocre square from a central square. Okay, the queen is protecting the square on d5, but knight goes away from the center where it's likely to be targeted by some of the aggressive attempts by black. So now black goes ahead and develops the bishop on e6, where it's going to be targeting the queen side. White goes ahead and plays g4. So generally, if you're a little bit familiar with the dragon defense, you will see white going for h4 and h5 advance. The g4 idea is common as well. For one thing, it could help white go h4, h5. And another advantage of g4 is that after d5, white now has g5. However, to be honest, this is still a viable option for black, even in this position. d5 move is definitely something black could consider. g5, okay, and here, without any prior analysis, I would say, okay, knight h5. Let's just play this move. E takes d, then black can capture this knight right here, and b takes c, queen d5. Getting a pawn back, and white's pawn structure is just messed up. Black has advantage. Now, if knight goes ahead and takes, well, black can now capture this pawn on b2, rook b1. If black wants to get adventurous, he or she may consider some in-between stuff, but here, let's say some sort of reasonable move like bishop e5. And even if white does get some sort of a material compensation for this sloppiness and awkward pawn structure, black is going to have plenty of play along the black squares. So this is just much better for black. Now, okay, the d5 was that opportunity, despite the fact that white played two moves in a row to prevent d5. The best way actually to deal with d5 is not to go for that and just develop naturally, where other better opportunities countering d5 arise. So now let's go ahead and continue with knight b3, bishop e6, g4. So here we're going to be examining the famous game, and probably the most prominent game in the dragon variation, 𝐃𝐫𝐚 versus Panov. 𝐃𝐫𝐚 represented black in this position, and within a few moves we're going to see a very interesting maneuver by black. You could say a trick, you could say a positional sacrifice, which makes a big point as far as what dragon system represents. So here black goes ahead and plays knight b7, which is interesting because generally knight would go to c6. So what is black's idea with this knight bd7 move? Well, number one, let's acknowledge the fact that it's a very good development move, and knight is going towards some key squares such as b6, e5, involving the maneuver to c4 square. And the advantage of having the knight on d7 versus having the knight on c6, which doesn't often arise for black, since knight c6 development is generally pretty natural in all other variations of dragon. So the advantage of knight bd7 is the opportunity for the rook to come to c8 and be active right here right away, without having to move the knight to e5 or a5 to open up this c file. So here white goes ahead and continues queen d2, which is the program move here for white, where white is targeting the queen side and preparing for a long castle. Knight goes to b6. So here we go, knight goes to b6, targeting the c4 square. Castle, natural move, rook goes to c8. Now, knight c4 would probably be a bit premature, since bishop would take, bishop takes, and now white is free to start marching on the king side. So what is it that black has in mind besides this advance to c4? Or why did black even play knight b6 if he doesn't go for knight c4? Well, the thing is, a lot of the times, instead of defining your action, defining your plan, what you want to do is build it up. Build up the opportunities, because then you will have more chances not only to introduce your idea, but through the ability to create threats, create other opportunities along the lines and explore them. So here a rook goes to c8, and the power of rook c8 now is that this rook c3 sacrifice, which is fairly typical in dragon variation, becomes pretty strong in different circumstances. So imagine white goes to h4. Let's think in terms of this sacrifice. Now, white could take with a queen or with a pawn. If white takes with a pawn, well, by default, black has got compensation now, because there's obviously a downside to this structure where white is going to have to be very precise in his play later on. Meanwhile, black has very straightforward attacking chances of doubling right here and playing knight a4, and just tons of opportunities to go up against black's queen side. So here, let's say queen takes on c3 without spoiling the pawn structure, and here black could capture either pawn, g4, e4, and the e4 looks more attractive after queen e1. The situation is such that black has to come back, and white continues to h5. So now let's say this position is actually highly advantageous for white, and white is on his way to create the decisive winning edge in this game. So this knight e4 is not quite worth it, because it not only doesn't get the compensation that you would need for an exchange, but it also wastes time, since knight doesn't have further opportunities after it jumps to e4 and has to come back. So here we're not going to go for rook c3. What we could do against h4 though is actually think in terms of, okay, well, what does my opponent want to do? Well, obviously h5 and then followed by bishop h6 or queen h2 situations where white is going to be going for some checkmate threats. The typical maneuver here for black is to push this pawn to h5. And here if white goes ahead and shuts it down, well, then black is just free rolling and relocating the knight to a very good spot where it can jump right here, come right here, target a bunch of squares, and also the bishop opens up, and this just becomes deadly. So if white goes ahead and continues right here, knight goes h5, and the idea for black here is actually to take with the rook, still take with the rook rather than the bishop, because bishop is not only the strongest attacking piece but part of the defensive mechanism. So here I'd definitely prefer black in this position. Now white in this game preferred the bishop h6, which seems like generally good looking move, probably the most interesting spot in terms of the positional aspect of this video. So here, if we really jump a step ahead, we're going to realize that there's essentially two major ways that black can continue. What happened in the game is an ingenious idea by 𝐃𝐫𝐚𝐠𝐸, who is actually famous for for not only the moves, but just the type of thinking that he brought to the table. And essentially just outside the box idea of removing bishop from g7 to h8. And you would say, well, how come you're playing that? Your first instinct, if you're not familiar with this type of sacrifices, is to say, well, you know what, you just blundered your rook right here on f8. And that is close to being correct if you consult one of the advanced engines such as Ripke or Fritz or whatever it is. And yeah, that is a blunder from an objective point. However, it proves a major point, and the point being such that this bishop on h8 is just going to be so powerful that giving up the rook rather than exchanging the bishop is a much better trade-off for black. Now, how is black gonna prove his ability to gain compensation for the missing exchange? And the compensation involves not only attacking opportunities, also the defensive opportunities. Let's examine queen f8, and let's say white goes ahead for the kingside attack. And the fact of the matter is, black is going to be getting aggressive one move after another. And here, reasonably, black's idea is to push h5. That could be the case, but let's examine something fairly neutral, like knight fd7. Now, let's just think in terms of what can white create right here. And the situation is such that, let's just say black goes ahead and plays bishop g7, h takes g, h takes g, and queen goes to h2. Now we're gonna remove the queen to d8. And the thing is, this attempt by white to create attacking opportunities on the king side are fairly limited, since after white achieves just about 100% of what he can here on the king side, there's no continuation to create any decisive checkmating threats. So let's just say queen h8, right, which is just kind of staring at us. Bishop h8, rook h8, king g7, rook takes d8, rook takes d8. Well, this endgame is slightly better for black still, because of the better king, because of the weakened black squares, which the king is actually going to be exploring, and a lot of squares for black's pieces. The open file where the black's rook is going to rush. So this is strategically a very unpleasant position for white. So after just let's take a look at this situation. Well, there aren't really too many resources where white can create big threats to black's king. And let's not forget that black is just about to get aggressive on the queen side, which he could have done a few moves earlier. So the point was such that, okay, well, in terms of attacking opportunities, obviously this bishop is going to be a monster. And in terms of defense, having the bishop on g7 solves most of the problems. So we got the situation right here. White goes ahead and takes on f8, queen takes, and white continues knight d4. Well, this is a natural, good-looking move. Knight comes back where it belongs, attacking the bishop on e6. Well, now black goes to c4, and the idea is such that if you play knight to c4 generally, then well, in this position, of course, there's this in-between move, knight e6. However, generally, let's say bishop c4, bishop c4. Well, the thing is that the bishop on c4 is not doing anything pretty much. There's no real threat to a2, and the best thing to do is to come up with some sort of an idea to remove it from there, or push and create other ideas, since bishop is kind of blocking this c file right here. Now, when the bishop goes to c4, on the other hand, takes over the square, where after bishop exchange, knight is going to rush right there, and the knight is doing very good on c4, since it targets some of the key squares right. Bishop c4 white goes for g5, another obvious attacking move. Well, now I got a point to make here. The fact of the matter is, this g5 move helps black. If it's black's move in this position, knight fd7 idea right here is actually a very good logical continuation for black, since it opens up the bishop, and this knight on f6 doesn't really do quite as much in terms of attacking opportunities, since these pawns are pretty much untouchable. You can't really get through, and they're restricting this knight quite a bit. So once knight goes to d7, it maneuvers towards some of the more attractive spots and continues to create some aggressive situations. So here, after g5, knight fd7, this really helps black to improve his game and improve his attacking chances. And at the same time, it even looks like it shuts down some of the white's resources. Well, possibly white's idea was knight h5, and since white probably thought that after knight fd7 he would create this big game on the king side, which didn't quite happen. Okay, so here bishop goes to h3. So before white does that, he goes ahead and pins the knight. But at the same time, this is another mistake, second mistake in a row. And why is it a mistake? Well, it's going to become obvious after we find the move for black. So the bishop is pinning the knight right here. And what we got to do is pretty much unpin it. And now the pawn goes to e6, and this is not a very natural move in dragon. It's a rare move in dragon, since it really weakens this d6 pawn right here. The fact of the matter, though, this position changed so much from a regular dragon position, since now we have where black is exchanged down, and there's this powerful bishop on the diagonal, and black is pretty much in charge of the central situation, since after e6 he's going to be very likely to move on with d5. So black is really in charge of the game, so certain moves that are generally not possible become viable options. So here king goes to b1, so it looks like a timely prophylaxis by white. Black goes ahead and plays knight e5. Now this is where the most exciting part of the game comes in. What is black's idea? Well, rather than trying to guess, let's just continue with the game. Pawn goes to f4, which is the most challenging response that black has to counter with. And here you won't believe black's idea, since it's knight goes to f3, attacking the queen and targeting the knight on d4, and pretty much just giving up the knight. So what's the trick to this sacrifice, where it's not even taking a pawn on f3, it's just basically just giving up the knight on f3 for the sake of opening up this diagonal right here. So knight takes on f3 is pretty much forced. Bishop goes ahead and captures on c3. Now it becomes a little more obvious, since after queen takes c3, it's pretty easy for us to find this shot right here. Bishop takes a2, opening up the rook, and we call it discovered check. King takes a2, rook c3, b takes c, and here the idea is d5. So now let's count the material. White has two rooks for a queen and a pawn. Essentially there's the knight for a knight, two rooks for a queen and a pawn, and there's pretty much an extra bishop. You could, from a practical perspective, that would be a correct assumption. However, looking in terms of this particular situation, the threats of queen c5 and this coordination between the knight and the queen are liable to prove decisive. So let's say white goes ahead and secures some of the squares on the king side. Queen comes to c5, and now the pawn is hanging right here. King goes to b2, and knight comes to c4. King goes to c1. Queen goes to a3. Now, it's not very easy for white to come up with the moves. This, for example, loses a rook, or black could also continue to c3, and just pretty much things fall apart, considering just how many attacking threats and how much coordination black gains with this two pieces. By the way, just making a point, queen and the knight is just one of those combinations, such as a pair of bishops, where this coordination becomes really more than just the advantage that those pieces have to offer on their own or separately. So here the black just gains an incredible attack, and pretty much continues on to win the game if white decides to give up the queen. And now, after bishop takes c3, white goes ahead and takes with a pawn. So here the situation is such that black is down a rook. However, the counter-attacking chances are just unstoppable. So pawn goes to d5, and this is a very important move where black's queen connects with the queen side. White really has to deal with this queen a3 threat, along with maneuvers such as rook c6 and knight a4, which would definitely add a lot of momentum to the attack. So queen goes to c1, protecting the square. Knight goes to a4. And one point about attacking is, especially attacking when you're down material, you're really looking for ways to make your opponent respond to your threats. You really want your opponent to be on the defensive, responding to the attacking opportunities that you're creating. Now white decides to get a little aggressive, and instead of defending the pawn, which is actually not really possible, king a1 is an option. However, it doesn't really save this pawn, where this knight becomes, not only that knight captures the pawn, but it just becomes a very strong piece on c3, where it's targeting other key spots. So white goes ahead and takes on d5. So here, let's just look at this position for a second and assess what is exactly that's going on, and what is black's opportunities, because black is the one who needs to prove the legitimacy of his sacrifice. And the compensation comes in several ways. And obviously, I mean, in this position, black is missing a whole rook. So it's not only just the open king that compensates for the missing material, but this pieces on the king side, which are not quite in the game, that in contrast, black's pieces on a4, c4, rook c8, queen on f8, ready to jump in and get very active, that are very well connected with this aggressive threats against white's king. So here it's quite unexpected that black continues the attack with another sacrifice. Bishop takes on a2. And it kind of reminds a little bit about the principle of Backhouse, where time is very important, and a lot of the times you're going to drop a piece just to create more momentum, create more time for the lethal threats. Here's the situation where this is exactly what black is doing. Instead of going for knight c3 and not even thinking about the possibility of giving up this knight for this rook, which is really giving up this knight for the rook. It's not even trading, because the knight is just so strong where it can be creating the massive threats towards the king. Black is not really thinking about it. However, knight c3, I'm sure, is a viable option, but bishop a2 is just something that black calculated and found very attractive opportunities to finish off the game. So king goes to a1. White doesn't trust the fact that he can capture the bishop on a2. So let's examine this continuation. Takes on a2, knight takes on c3, king a1, queen jumps right here, and the threat of queen a5 or queen a4, a2 is pretty much lethal. Queen b2, queen a5, queen here, checkmate. Queen right here, obviously checkmate right here. Now, what if rook d4? Well, same thing. Queen goes to a5, and after king d2, queen comes right here and checkmate. So let's think king goes to b2, queen b4, with the same idea of a checkmate, king b3. Now this is just a little bit more challenging. The queen still comes right here. And let's think and play knight d4. Queen takes on d5. King comes right here. Queen comes right here. King comes right here. And rook c4 checkmate. So the king is really in a dangerous spot, and taking the bishop on a2 just loses the game almost right away. It's pretty much a checkmate. So here white goes ahead and continues king a1. Knight takes on c3. Now white really wants to create some attacking chances, since the defense is not quite that attractive. After queen c5, queen a5, black is going to be creating some lethal chances to finish off his opponent. So now white goes ahead and plays d takes c, and it really looks like this could be a legitimate counterplay for white. Black jumps with the queen to c5 without much care about the e6 f7 situation. So now let's play the most obvious move, e takes f, bishop f7, and now this is very good for black, since that bishop came from a2 to f7 and it's no longer blocking this file where the queen is going to be coming in and checkmating. Now let's say bishop c8. What is black going to do now? Well, now black is coming to a5, king b2, and the difference is such that with the rook being no longer on c8, the idea of queen a2 is not working. Now let's consider queen b4, king a1, and it doesn't seem like black has any decisive solutions. So let's go back to a5 check, king b2, and play knight a4, king a1, queen c3, king b1, queen b4, king a1. Doesn't look like black is finishing the game here either. So let's go back. Bishop takes c8. So what did black have in mind here? Well, here's where the trick comes in. Queen goes to a5, king b2, and here an incredible opportunity for black. Knight goes to e2. And what's the idea of knight e2? Well, first and foremost, it creates this checkmate opportunity right here on a2, where knight controls this square, and queen a2 is just a checkmate. Queen a1, queen b4, checkmate. Now, what is white supposed to do after knight e2? Well, most likely just give up the queen, and not even so easy to see the move. Let's say c4, then black doesn't even take right away, probably makes this check right here, king goes to a1, and continues right here, rook takes, queen a3, king b1, queen f3. So similar situation where black's coordination is just going to be decisive in this position, where there's so many weak spots and black's pieces are just going to be coming in and winning material. So in this situation right here, white goes for rook d4. This is very logical. We're really looking at this position from a perspective of black, and it's obviously very attractive. Black has so many options, really going for the checkmates, and white is barely catching up. Now, the fact of the matter, a lot of times we may be on the other side of the coin where we have to defend, and we really gotta find the resources, and rook d4 is one of those moves, or at least it looks like the move that could save the game. And now black goes ahead and takes on e6, attacking the bishop on h3. Pretty much white is gonna take there 100% of the time. Pawn takes, and here that's where the challenge comes in. White played rook a4. Now, what's a better option for white? Rook a4 obviously just gives up a piece on a4. But how do you ever prevent queen goes to a5? And the fact of the matter is there is no way to prevent that, rather than just give up the rook on a4. Let's say queen e3. Then instead of choosing the long route, black just comes in right here with the checkmate. Queen b2, queen a5, and checkmate. So here there's nothing really better than just giving up this rook on a4. Well, obviously black is very satisfied with the results of the game. He's not only creating decisive checkmate opportunities, but also picking up the material, and now got extra pawn. White goes ahead and plays c4, trying to essentially stop black from coming in with a queen. Rook goes to d8, which is kind of a cool, in a way, a greedy move that doesn't want to be going for this, where obviously the position is completely winning with 2 extra pawns, and black is going after another pawn. But black is really maximizing the opportunities, and this being greedy in this situation is actually a very important skill to develop, because you want to get the most out of your position, not just grab another pawn and then play an endgame for another 10-15 moves, but go for the checkmate. Go for the best opportunity that's going to finish the game right there. Now if rook d1, then black is going to capture, queen a3, coming in, checkmate. And if knight e5, then black has a few options, including queen b4, and actually a mysterious looking rook d6, where the rook is just going to become a monster attacking threat on the king side, finishing the game. Queen b4, c5, knight c5, connecting the rook with the attack, connecting the knight with the attack, and rook is coming in. So pretty much this is the end of the game. Now rook d8, white preferred king a2 in the game, queen b4, rook e1. Finally this rook comes in the game just to witness the arrival of black's rook and the decisive checkmating threat on the queen side. Knight c3, and just by the look of this position we know this is the end of the game. Now if king comes right here, we make this check, king b2 checkmate, and if white decides to continue, it would have to be queen c3, and obviously this is just not enough to hold on in this game. White resigns. So this is the game that we just saw, which was Panov versus 𝐶𝐸𝐴𝐚. So knight f3, d6, d4, c takes d, knight d4, knight f6, attacking the pawn on e4, knight goes to c3, we fianchetto the bishop, or planning to do it, and bishop e3 the main line. Okay, there's several options such as bishop e2, classical, f4, and g3. So those are, you would say, lesser main lines, or rather side lines. But what you really got to focus on as your first steps to master dragon variation is bishop e3, because that's where all the ideas, that's where all the aggressive stuff, that's where all the most principal stuff. Bishop g7, pawn goes to f3, preventing the knight from going to g4, also solidifies the e4 square. Black goes ahead and castles, and here we examine this move right here, knight b3, which is not 100% the most principled line. However, it allowed us to delve into the most interesting ideas that black can go for in dragon opening. So now actually we're gonna do a little review and see a little deeper into what was happening in the game. So black went ahead and played bishop e6, and this is a square that you guys gotta remember. Okay, bishop can, it's an interesting spot for the bishop, and if you could put it there in various spots, it could be a strong attacking piece. g4. So the idea of g4 was to prevent d5, and ironically, as we discussed, d5 is actually a possibility. Now we said, okay, well, g5 is not really preventing it, since knight h5 just gives black a great play, since if pawn takes pawn, then bishop takes on c3, and black is just in an awesome shape here. So here actually it's not g5 but e5, and that's a move that you guys got to be familiar with, because that's what oftentimes coming in, generally in Sicilians, if black tries to break through with extremely attractive d5. Now black has a couple options. It's knight d7 and knight e8. So let's just pick one, doesn't matter, let's say knight e8. And here white is gonna go ahead and obviously solidify the pawn on e5. So now let's make another logical move, knight c6. Okay, well actually let's consider, okay, knight c6, let's just say, well, what really comes to mind is, okay, well, white really wants to continue with the plan and castle long, especially right now there's going to be quite a bit of pressure put on d5, and you kind of want to play queen d2 and go ahead and castle. However, what's obvious also is bishop g2, and it's difficult for black to really defend this pawn, which forces knight to go to c7, and after that white can go ahead and secure this pawn on g4 to have the opportunity to move the queen. And here what black would really want to do is break in right here in the center. Now white would go ahead and take the pawn. Let's say taking with the bishop is a little more resourceful, and here it's not that easy to stop black from playing d4, so white would have to block it with knight d4, creating this little blockade. And I would say, and what it allows for is bishop takes d4 right here, bishop d4, rook f4, winning a pawn. There's a high possibility that white would have a reasonable compensation in this position. However, let's get back and see what white could have done better here. So maybe instead of bishop g2, we would consider a move such as queen f3. And here what's obvious is black has this opportunity d4, and white could just go ahead and castle, and most likely just going to be winning this pawn on d4 because the queen is pinned right here. Actually not that obvious. Bishop takes b3, 8 takes b, and queen could jump right here. So long story short, we could conclude that there could be some chances for black. However, if we do find the right way to get things going for white, it may well happen that white would get a big advantage here in this position. So let's get back to the review of the game and say that knight went to d7. Now you can see all of these arrows, and basically what they mean is the fact that knight has a lot of different opportunities to go from d7 to e5, b6, c4. Actually knight c6 is just about as good of an option having the a5 and e5 going to c4. However, here maybe there's a slight advantage in placing the knight to d7, since after rook c8, rook is going to be putting pressure along the c file. Queen d2, knight b6, white goes ahead and castles, and rook goes to c8, and black is ready to attack. All the pieces are set up, and here white went for this typical dragon idea, exchanging the bishops. And as you guys remember, bishop went to h8, sacrificing this rook right here, and potentially giving black complete dominance over this diagonal due to this bishop on h8. So black did gain a powerful initiative and turned it into a crushing victory. However, here there's another interesting idea, actually even more typical, by far more typical idea in dragon, which black could implement if he goes ahead and captures on h6. Queen takes h6, and here rook takes on c3. And here's the exchange sacrifice where black gives up the rook for a knight to create weaknesses on the king side. B takes, and queen goes to c7. So now black is targeting the queen side with all the different resources right here. Rook c8, knight goes to a4, then there's also d5 hanging, and after, let's say, queen e3, and queen e3 essentially is a signal that white cannot really advance on the king side and at the same time manage to maintain defense on the queen side. So king side attack and queen side defense just wouldn't go hand in hand. And here rook goes to c8, putting pressure right here. And what's interesting, say white says, okay, well, if you want to win the pawn, let's just exchange the queens and I'm going to have a winning endgame because of extra exchange. Well, things are not that simple. Queen c3, queen takes c3, rook c3, and let's say white goes ahead and plays bishop d3, preparing to improve the king, maybe put a little pressure on the king side, expand on the king side a little bit, maybe bring the knight in the game. So it's several things on white's mind. However, this position is very resourceful for black and very unlikely to be worse for black because of just many resources that black has and very few weaknesses. However, here black doesn't even have to take on c3, and after knight goes to a4, well, as you see, there's this big arrow right here, and basically what it means is, okay, well, we don't have that powerful bishop on h8. However, as you could see, there's knight on a4, queen c7, rook c8, bishop e6 that are just powerfully interacting to create massive attacking opportunities. So let's say white goes ahead and plays c4 right here. We could think of a way to defend the pawn on c3, but there's pretty much no way to do that, and white has to get resourceful in trying to give it up. Now, here black could just simply capture the pawn right here. Another option that is very attractive is b5. So those are the two possibilities, but let's just examine the bishop c4. Bishop takes c4, queen c4, and now white goes ahead and plays rook h2, protecting the pawn on c2. Which is a cool, resourceful move where rook is being used along the horizontal lines rather than vertical lines. So here, black plays a powerful knight c3, targeting two squares right here, and let's say white goes ahead and plays rook d4, kind of in the spirit of this position. The problem with this, though, that now after queen f1, white is just losing the game. King b2, queen b1, and checkmate in two moves right here. So here, very difficult situation for white, and most likely after rook d2, black's gonna pick up another pawn. King goes to b2. Actually, rook d2 falls into the same exact situation where after queen f1, queen is coming in and making a checkmate. After rook e1, knight goes to a2, and basically king b2, knight b4, just an unstoppable initiative with a lot of weaknesses on white's part, and black is just going to be coming in and checkmating and winning a lot of material. So here black goes ahead and captures the bishop on h6, queen takes h6, and we go for this sacrifice, which didn't take place in the game. However, it's actually the stronger idea for black to implement. B takes c, queen goes to c7, and here let's consider rook goes to d3. So here the situation with bishop c4 could actually be pretty interesting. Attacking the rook right here, rook e3, we can capture the bishop right here, or maybe make a move like rook c8, seeing how white wants to respond. If white plays h4, then we're gonna go ahead and capture this bishop, distracting the rook from h1, going to f1, and then we would play knight c4, rook goes to d3, and here knight e5, attacking the rook, rook goes to e3, and here we have all kinds of shots right here, knight g4, which would give us a powerful compensation. There's a move like queen b6, maybe possibly even going h6, targeting these two guys. Queen b6 was pretty strong right here, and also going for knight g4. So quite a few threats, and I would estimate this position as winning for black. Just too many resources for black, and white has to defend, and the position is just not pretty, despite the extra exchange. What would be another option? What wouldn't work is knight c4 right here, which just kind of blocks things. There's still very good opportunities for black, and let's say after knight c4 or continuing d5, black develops powerful initiative. What would be stronger, maybe to play d5 right away, and after e takes d, you could connect with this knight. However, you would have to consider h4, h5 ideas, where this knight is actually key for our defense. So maybe knight b d5 now, and here knight would have this nice little target, and if c4, well, for one thing, black could just capture this pawn. Here the pawn is hanging on c3, and just after king b2, rook goes to c8, and not so easy for white to defend, and white has to pull back again. And here there's quite a few options, including a5, knight b6, with the idea of knight a4, attacking the king and winning this pawn right here. A lot of very, very strong ideas, and I'm sure you guys would see more options on black's part to develop the initiative. So here, just a wonderful, wonderful position after the sacrifice on c3, which is possible after we exchange the bishops on h6, distracting the queen and capturing that knight right there. So now let's go ahead and continue with the flow of the game. Bishop went to h8, which is another beautiful idea on black's part. Bishop goes to h8, bishop captures the rook on f8, queen f8, and knight went to d4. So this is a very nice logical move. Knight is being placed in the center. Bishop went to c4. White went for g5, and which was a little mistake, since it improves the position of the knight. Improves. Knight goes to d7, and connecting with this square and various ways to attack. And knight on f6, as we mentioned, wasn't quite as active. Bishop went to h3, and we qualified this move as another mistake, since after e6, bishop is blocked by this pawn right here, and bishop is blocking the king side expansion right here. King b1, and knight went to e5, and after f4, here's this beautiful sacrifice knight f3. The fact of the matter, though, is that this game wasn't 100% perfect, and I must be honest with you guys and show you the ways that white could have defended to make it way more challenging for black to prove the legitimacy of the sacrifice right here. So knight f3, knight takes on f3, bishop c3, and here white had a very good and actually obvious option to get resourceful in this game, and that would be queen d6 right here. And this is really in the spirit of the position and the ideas that white should be considering. Queen d6, and white really wants to exchange those queens. Okay, the attack is getting strong here on black's part, so queen d6 is definitely the idea to try to save the game. And actually the best that the black has in this position is bishop e2, making a little fork right there. Bishop goes to g2, bishop d1, rook takes d1, bishop g7, queen f8, king f8, exchanging the queens. And after c3, white has a very good advantage, having an extra pawn and possibility of getting even more. So really, white had much better options to continue the game. So that was the spot that white could have turned things around. After b takes c, d5, black connected the pieces with the attack. However, white was still not completely lost. After queen c1, knight went to a4, black is developing this powerful attack right here. E takes d, bishop takes a2, and if king takes, then black creates this mating net and just finishes the game within a few moves. King a1, knight takes c3, d takes c, queen jumps to c5, ready to go to a5 with the discovered check, or first remove the bishop and check right there, checkmate. So here white played rook d4 in the game, and after bishop e6, f takes e, right here black created just a powerful threat, and the best thing that white had is rook a4, giving up the rook and letting black equalize in material, and just a killer initiative just decides the game in a few moves. Here though, white had a brilliant opportunity, starting with e7 right here, with the idea to come in with the rook to d8, and also targeting the rook on c8, bishop takes c8, right? So here queen a5, preparing for this discovered check. And here the best thing for white to do is to just capture the rook. Now let's consider what black has in mind in terms of the finishing attacking touch right here. Bishop e6, king b2, queen b4, king a1, queen a5, king b2, knight a4, king b1, queen b4, king a1, queen c3, and check right here. King goes to a1, check right here. We can make all of those checks, but we just don't have the opportunity, we don't have the resources to finish the game in a forced way, and the attack has to be finished in a forced way. Otherwise, white just has a million opportunities to create massive counterplay, and white has just a bunch of extra pieces, 2 rooks, a pawn which is just about to win. So black has to accept this draw. So that's the result of this powerful attack in looking from a very objective perspective. Another game by 𝐃𝐫𝐚𝐠𝐨, this one is, which is where white used a very similar approach, but here white did play queen d2, black played knight c6. So bishop c4 is the main line, castle is another main line. White played g4 in this position, which is another possibility, which prevents black again from using this d5 breakthrough. Black went ahead and took on d4. Another typical idea which you can see in different variations of dragon. Knight takes on d4, bishop captures the knight, and bishop is developed to e6 right here. So bishop finds that comfortable spot on e6 again. White goes ahead and castles, and black continues to target the queen side. This is a little prophylaxis which is very common for white, to move that king to b1, moving the king off this c file and defending the pawn on a2. Rook goes from f8 to c8, and this is very important for you guys to know. Rook goes to c8 from f8 rather than from a8 to c8, because the other rook right there could be useful for the queenside attack. Let's say, for example, after rook b8 and pushing this b5 right here. So rook fc8, and white goes for the attack on the king side. All of a sudden, h4 is a mistake in this position. Why is it a mistake? Well, the fact of the matter is black put just about enough pressure right here to make this shot possible right here. Rook captures c3, and the a2 is undefended. And you could say, well, black is just giving up an exchange. Is the initiative going to be enough to justify this sacrifice? And as we're going to see, that is going to be enough. Rook takes on c3, actually more than enough. Queen a2, king c1, bishop takes on g4. This is another powerful sacrifice which targets both of the important squares here on the king side, e4 and g4. Black gives up the bishop right here for a bunch of pawns and a killer finishing idea right here. Bishop takes g4. What could white do potentially? Well, the fact of the matter, if white doesn't want to accept the sacrifice, let's say playing bishop c4, here we get to realize that the key idea for black is to play bishop h6 right here. Boom. Bishop goes to e3. Bishop captures. Queen e3. And we just capture this bishop right here on c4. And these squares are weak. Rook goes to c8. And one of these pawns is going to fall down to the knight. Knight is going to get to a better position. Most likely it's going to be some sort of an endgame where black just has a bunch of stuff for an exchange. It's a completely winning position for black. So here, let's say white goes ahead and plays f takes g, which is kind of staring at us. This move right here. Queen goes to a1, king goes to d2, and actually that's the way the game continued. After knight e4, knight forks the king and the queen right here. The queen is hanging on a1 though, so it's not like black is winning all of that material right there. The queen is still hanging, so once knight captures on c3, white is going to be able to capture on a1. King e1 right here, and black does take on c3. White takes on a1, but the rook is no longer protecting the d4 bishop right here. So bishop captures d4. And what's interesting, if white goes ahead and captures on c3 after bishop takes c3, the rook is hanging on a1. So black didn't just wake up and got all lucky. Here black saw this particular variation and saw that spot from this point. So when you guys sacrifice, you gotta calculate way in advance, and this is something we can learn in this situation. We could say, okay, well, this is promising, but when we're talking sacrificing two pieces, this is not just a pretty idea. It's got to be really solid calculation. And after rook c3, queen c3, black does have enough potential to justify the sacrifice on c3. If we don't have the bishop g4, we would have to find other resources. So let's consider, let's say bishop g4 is not there. How could we continue with the attack? Well, we could make this check right here. King goes to d2 and queen a4, with the idea of capturing this pawn on e4 and targeting the d4. Well, you could say, well, how about bishop takes f6? Well, this would just be a terrible move for white, since after bishop f6, black is targeting the queen side. The bishop just becomes a monster right here without the opponent on d4. So here, king would have to go to e1 most likely, or let's consider returning back to c1. The problem with this move is that rook c8 is possible. This bishop is protecting this rook right here, and all of the pieces are just targeting the queen side right here. So there's a terrible spot for white, where black could actually return to a1 at his convenience and create more damage right there. Now let's say king e1. The king is right there in the center, which is not the least of the common ideas in white's repertoire. Oftentimes black is successful in creating some momentum on the queen side, so the best thing for white a lot of the times is to transfer the king, queen a1, king d2, queen a4, the more straightforward looking. And there is a powerful sacrifice, as we see in the both of 𝐃𝐫𝐚𝐠𝐸's games. He went for this interesting sacrifices, which in this case this is 100% legit, and as we're gonna see, gives black powerful initiative to recover the material later on. So pawn takes. Now we thought about bishop c4, and the problem with this situation is not that only black is sacrificing the bishop and capturing pawns, but bishop wants to go to h6, which is a powerful resource, and there's a few in between resources that would help white avoid losing more material. So they gotta take the bishop, queen makes a check, and you could say, why not take on e4? Well, if knight takes on a4, then queen goes to a3, and now there's no longer that decisive check right there, and bishop h6 runs into g5, blocking the bishop. So black obviously doesn't want to exchange queens at this point, having still having this powerful attack. So queen goes to a1, and now we got a fork going on, king d1, king e1, and here black takes the queen right there on c3. There's not too many ways that black can continue, except for maybe queen d1 as an alternative, and king d1, knight c3, and here after b takes c. This is a bit of an unbalanced situation where black has a bunch of pawns for bishop. So here I'd say it's definitely a playable situation, but black has better ideas, which is knight c3, rook a1, bishop d4. Now there's a little fork going on if white decides to capture the knight. So white doesn't. White goes ahead and plays bishop g2, and knight retreats. Now the b2 is hanging, so bishop can capture on b7, but then black would play rook b8, and after a move like bishop c6, bishop would capture the pawn right there, and if rook b1, then boom, knight c3, and the rook is trapped right there. So the rook was trying to pin the bishop, but now it's trapped. So let's say rook a6, and then bishop d4 or knight d4 both give black extremely powerful game right here. So where the compensation is just more than enough. So this position is probably going to be winning for black. So white decides to play c3 right here. There are a couple options, like creative ones, like rook h3, say, and if black decides to capture the pawn, after rook b1, bishop c3, king d1. The pieces are a bit tied up, so black is gonna have to give some stuff up and potentially get into some other unbalanced situations. So here white does have some resources, but black does come out on top after c3. Knight captures, b takes c, and bishop c3. Here, obviously, black is going to be capturing the rook, and after rook takes, 𝐶𝐸𝐴𝐺 goes for the pawn push. Now, the pawn is hanging, but it's impossible for black to save the other pawn, or save both pawns. So here, a5, bishop b7, rook a7, and here this is the end of the game. So possibly white resigned, or the game continued. And as you guys know, in the 60s, the games were delayed towards the second day, or maybe sometimes even for another day, where the opponents had where the chess players had time to analyze, go over the games and go over the end games, and see what's like the most optimal, the best way to play the game. And possibly white analyzed this position in depth and realized that there's very few resources to save the game. So here we could take a look at a couple situations where bishop comes back and then e6. Then we have the king coming up, and this is the difficult position for white to play, since there's pawns on the king side, and there's this pawn, which the pawn on a5, which the rook is tied up to. Bishop c4, preventing the d5. We looked at some classical examples of dragon variation originating. So we got some key ideas for us to apply dragon, and apply it with inspiration to improve and keep progressing towards better game and more masterful tactical ideas. Here, bishop c4 allows for the modern Chinese dragon variation, which we're going to be examining in our future series. Another important aspect to it is castle right away, where white allows black to develop the initiative via d4, knight c6, b takes c, e takes d, knight captures, and here there's bishop d4 and knight d5, leading to some very interesting unbalanced double-edged situations. Bishop f5 right here, attacking the checkmate on c2. The best thing to do is sacrifice the queen. King captures. Another angle to a dragon variation is positional lines, gradual lines associated with bishop e2. So that's the classical approach. There's g3 ideas, and there's a sharper f4 line, which we're going to be examining in our future series. We're going to be looking at the game Karpov-Krasnoy. As you can see, the position after bishop e3, where black goes ahead and continues to develop the bishop to g7, f3, protecting against knight g4 and supporting the pawn on e4. Black goes ahead, develop the knight, queen e2, castle, bishop c4. So the key about this move compared to seemingly logical castle is bishop c4 keeps the pawn from advancing to d5 in the center, creating a very strong counterplay for black. Now, it's not necessary to stop it. Castle is another main line in this position, and after d5, white has various options which we're going to discuss later on. Now, bishop c4 is a very good move, defending the d5 square, and preparing to do some prophylaxis and continue to get the attack going via h4 and h5. Black goes ahead and plays bishop d7. Now, e6 square is not available anymore. There's situations where black would exchange and potentially play something along the lines of bishop e6. However, there's certain disadvantages to it, as you can obviously see. Bishop e6, and there's going to be double pawns. Now, bishop d7. The idea is to improve the rook, go to c8, and jump with the knight to e5 or a5, and create some counterplay. White goes ahead and plays h4. To be honest, the idea of h4, you could say, well, how come white is playing h4, having not castled or done the prophylaxis? Having played h4, white hasn't committed to playing h5 on the next move. Now black goes ahead and plays rook c8, and the bishop on c4 is in a dangerous spot, so white goes ahead and removes the bishop to b3. Knight goes to e5, preparing to jump to c4. Here's an interesting spot for white to consider this h5 idea. And now what's going to happen, black is going to capture, and here the best move would probably be to just castle. Now, let's say white goes ahead and plays g4. Here, black has an interesting way to escalate the situation, playing knight g3, which is not quite that common, as considering the fact that the knight is obviously getting trapped there, having been attacked once to rook g1. So here you can use your imagination to see what are the possibilities for black, and there's, as you can see, there's quite a few shots and possibilities. So here what black does is this classical idea of rook c3 sacrifice. B takes c3, and knight takes on f3, and this knight escapes effectively, capturing on e4 and targeting this c3 pawn. But you shouldn't forget the fact that black sacrificed quite a bit to get to this position, which is pretty much the whole rook. Black did pick up a few pawns, namely 3 pawns, and after bishop c3, got exactly 3 pawns for the rook. King goes to e2, and here bishop c6 and bishop takes a1 are both possible with a very good position for black, very good compensation. So here this is another typical tactical idea which you guys must memorize to succeed in Dragon. So here after 95, white goes for the logical castle, and black continues on with the idea to exchange the knight for one of the bishops. White does have an option of playing queen e2, and you may find certain examples where giving up the black squared bishop rather than the white squared bishop is more advantageous for white, since that bishop on b3 is it's just quite as dangerous as the bishop on e3, which wants to put positional pressure on the king side by exchanging the black squared bishops. Now bishop c4, rook c4, and white continues for h5. So here white did decide to give up this bishop for the knight and go ahead and create a massive attack on the king side right away. So let's see how far this attack gets. Knight takes on h5, white continues g4, knight f6. So here the logical continuation would be to play bishop h6. Now what is worth mentioning is, let's go back a couple moves before and consider this idea of bishop h6 right here without h5. So here there's a little problem with that, and you guys must know this idea for black, which gives a massive advantage right away. So bishop h6 is not a correct move in this position, and gives black a winning position after rook takes d4, queen takes d4, bishop takes h6. So the queen is in a bit of an overload situation where rook takes, queen takes, bishop h6, king moves. Now you could say, well, white is about to play h5, create some attack. Well, to be honest, this position is is strategically lost for white because of the strength of the pieces, and also tactically, since let's just say queen a5, h5, black doesn't have to pay attention to this, just put the bishop on back to g7, pawn takes, and the king side is very well secured. There's pretty much nothing that could happen on the king side, and the black is going to be continuing rook c8 and targeting with b5, and this position is just not going to be pleasant. After bishop e6, b5, black is going to be putting tons and tons of pressure and probably going to be winning within the next 10-15 moves. So the best way to go about the attack for white is to go ahead and continue to h5. Knight takes on h5, g4, knight f6. It's kind of cool for white to win this time where the knight goes back and forth, and at the same time get rid of this pawn on h4, which is pretty much blocking white's advance. So works out really well for white. So we reached this situation, and it seems very logical that white should be continuing bishop h6. However, that would be a positional mistake in this situation, and that sounds kind of surprising, I'm sure. The problem with bishop h6 is that black is going to go ahead and take, queen takes on h6. So now let's examine the possibilities that the white's got in this situation. And if it's white's move, white has this powerful knight d5 and not g5. So let's say, for example, let's play some sort of a neutral move a6. So here, knight goes to d5 and attacks the knight on f6 and threatening to continue queen h7. So here, this is not quite the end of the game, since this is the resource that is worth mentioning, rook e8. Once white takes on f6, e takes f, queen breaks in, so this position is going to be winning for white. Now, here g5 wouldn't work quite as well, since knight would go to h5 and block white's advance. Still, white has amazing chance. Rook h5, g takes h, and rook h1, and this position is winning for white as well. However, here what is very strong for black, obviously black is not going to be playing a6 in this position, and here black has a very powerful resource, which is rook takes on c3. Once again we see this sacrifice, which is just amazingly strong. B takes, queen goes to a5, and continuing with rook c8, continuing with b5, b4, potentially some checks on the queen side, putting more pressure, potentially e5 or d5. So quite a few resources for black to explore in this position, and I would definitely pick black in this situation. So here, white comes up with an amazing idea in this game. This is Karpov-Korchnoi. This situation had been played before. However, in this game, Karpov reinvents the situation, playing this new idea, which is knight d2, and this is an amazingly strong move. Knight d2 is certainly a wonderful idea. The white knight from e2 defends the knight on c3, and black doesn't have anything better but continuing the counterplay, queen a5, bishop goes to h6, and here we encounter this interesting idea once again. Bishop goes to h8, sacrificing the rook. So white would go ahead and capture the rook, king takes, and here we're gonna follow a game between two masters. King b1, doing a little prophylaxis. Black continues rook b4, an interesting resource, putting a little pressure on b2 right there. Let's say g5, knight goes to h5, knight goes to c1, trying to defend the queen side really well. Bishop e6, putting a little more pressure right there. Knight goes to b3, queen e5. So here black has very powerful control on these diagonals. White goes ahead and sacrifices, preparing for f4 and f5, making black's position, and actually f4, f5, and f6 making black's position a little bit uncomfortable. Black goes ahead for in between bishop b3. White goes ahead and captures on h7, and black finds this amazing resource. Bishop takes a2, king goes to c1, and if king takes on a2, or black would go ahead and continue queen a5, king b1, rook b2, sacrifice, king takes, queen b4, and black continues the attack in a very logical way. Rook gives up on h8, bishop takes, and massive compensation, just completely, actually material advantage and a completely winning position for black because of the attack. Black played pretty well. However, white didn't play the best moves in this game. However, it's always interesting to consider the possible resources, and in this case, bishop h8 is definitely a practical solution to how black can continue going about this position, examining in our future series. So here we're going to take a look at the modern examples of playing the sharpest lines of dragons. So let's go through the opening real quick. Knight goes to f3, d6. We're going to take a look at the modern examples of playing the sharpest lines of dragons. So let's go through the opening real quick. Knight goes to f3, d6. Knight f6, knight c3, develop the bishops. f3, securing the g4 square, solidifying the center. Knight c6, queen goes up, preparing for the castle. Castle, now black wants to play d5, so white develops the bishop at the same time, defending against d5. Black develops the bishop on the only available square. Bishop goes to b3, rook goes to c8. So now, in the previous game here, white continued h4 instead of bishop b3. However, here white preferred bishop b3, and only here h4. So now here's an interesting point. Black goes ahead and plays h5. So what it does, it keeps white from advancing with g4. At the same time, it does create a couple weaknesses around black's king. Those in particular, the h6, g5, and g6 got a little bit weaker. And it's not quite possible, seemingly, the idea of g4. Going for g4 looks a bit risky for white now, since black is going to be capturing and putting pressure on this whole center right here. However, this idea is feasible and actually happens quite a bit. So we're going to look at an example of this dynamic game where black comes up with interesting resources to develop the counterplay and hold white's initiative up until finding very cool resources to defend and finally seize the initiative. Goes ahead and castles. Knight goes to e5, and bishop goes to g5. So here black is no longer putting the pressure on d4, so white is free to put that bishop on g5. Now, if black decides to bother the queen with knight c4, then queen can simply go to d3 or e2, preparing for the maneuvers such as f4, e5. For that, probably queen d3 would be a little more solid. Now, black realizes that and goes ahead and plays rook c5. Rook c5 looks a bit of a mysterious move. Now, there's several continuations available to black, including queen a5, possible a6, and the idea of rook c5 is to connect the rook with the potential defense and counterattack. And you guys gonna realize what's the key point behind rook c5 once you see what's white's ideas. Here on the next move, white goes ahead and plays king b1. So that's a prophylaxis move, basically preparing for the attack, but saving the king from this diagonal, which oftentimes happens more often than you could imagine. This diagonal plays a key role for black to escape from white's attack and potentially get the good chances in the game. So rook goes to e8. Now this move looks a bit mysterious too. What's the point of that? It certainly weakens the square in f7. However, it protects the pawn on e7 in case the knight wants to jump, or in other tactical situations. And at the same time, it creates the space for the king, where the king go from g8 to f8 and to e7. And as you guys saw in the previous game that we analyzed, king oftentimes has to jump towards the center and hide there. And oftentimes that spot is actually safer than the king side itself. So here finally we reveal white's plan, and it's just to go for g5. Looks a bit crazy, but let's see what the variations are. Pawn takes on g4. Black goes ahead and captures on g4. And white continues h5. So here there's possibilities where rook goes to g1, and maybe one other option, such as, let's say, f4, with the idea of pushing f5 later on. However, in this key situation, white decides to play h5. If pawn takes on h5, then bishop would capture on f6, bishop f6, rook h5, and black is probably going to be in a bad shape after queen h6. There's still some defensive resources, but this game is definitely going to be favoring white initiative. So here, the knight takes on h5, and if white decides to capture on g4, well, then just bishop comes out right here with solidifying the h5 square. Okay, rook dg1 puts a little more pressure right there. However, black has more resources there compared to white's decision in the game, which is rook h5, sacrificing the rook for the knight and clearing the way for the queen to come in and start the attack. Now you guys can see the value of having the rook on c5, which is really guarding this fifth horizontal, helping black defend. Here, if black decides to go for sort of like the most obvious, most straightforward solution, like let's say knight f3, knight takes f3, g takes f, white is going to go ahead and capture on h5, and here there's a couple ways that black could continue, and black has to be fast, because with one thing, f7 is hanging, and rook is about to go to h1 or g1, creating big damage, and knight can jump to d5, really blocking the rook and pretty much separating dividing the black's queen side from king side, leaving the king side completely undefended, and having white develop the initiative right there very fast and going for the checkmating attack. So let's say bishop goes to e6, trying to exchange a piece and possibly stop the attack a little bit, and knight goes to d5. So that's a very strong move. Bishop captures pawn, the knight, and pawn captures the bishop. Let's say black decides to mobilize the queen from d7 or c8, trying to save the game. And now white has this powerful bishop h6, where the next move coming is going to be rook g1, and if f2, controlling the g1 square, then queen would go to g5. If black decides to capture with the idea of queen h6, queen g4, blocking this file right here, and if rook h1, maybe some sort of a queen g6, rather queen g7, so queen g6 just runs into a checkmate. However, even here, after queen h2, white has substantial ideas. The decisive action comes from bishop h6, bishop takes h6, rook g1, instead of queen h6, rook g1, check right here. Now, if king goes to h8, obviously queen h6 checkmate, king f8, same idea. If queen goes to h7, then f7 is hanging. So here in this position, black would prefer this one, and after queen g5, the checkmate is inevitable. So, a cool attack for white, and something black has to be definitely aware of. So, this is the game happening between Radjabov playing white and Carson playing black. So you got the best player in the world defending with black, and obviously tons of theory available in this position up until a few moves later in the game. So here black decides to play knight g6. White goes ahead and captures on h5, and black goes out with the queen to a5 to target the bishop. Now this is a very strong move, and it's not an obvious idea, since the knight on g6 is hanging right now because of this diagonal b3 g8. So here black attempted a tricky move like e6, which we're going to examine in the next game, where rook is pinning the bishop and going to be targeting the queen on h5. In this game black prefers queen a5. After queen a5, black targets the bishop on g5 with a rook c5 and a queen on a5. So queen is the one protecting it, so obvious consideration would be to play queen g6. The problem with this move, though, is that after e6, the queen is now vulnerable to the pawn attack. And after queen h5, rook g5, black totally seizes initiative, and there's just absolutely no attack for white, considering black's resources, such as, let's say, bishop d4 and activating the queen to e5, the pawn on f3 hanging, rook coming in. So this is just not going to be nice for white. So queen g6 is just bad. However, f4 is a very good resourceful move right here, and it does allow for knight f4. As you could see, rook comes in and attacks the bishop. However, this would be a terrible move, since after queen f7, king moves to h8 or h7, rook h1, knight h3, and queen h5. Rook h1 was actually optional. Knight f5 was also a possibility right here. So in this situation, after f4, rook takes g5, shutting down that bishop queen coordination, and gaining this e5 square for black's pieces. Pawn takes on g5, and white is obviously still hoping to break in, since the g6 and f7 are vulnerable. The bishop right here on this diagonal. A rook can go to f1 or h1. Here a big resource for black is obviously this e6 move, which black goes for right away. White wastes no time playing knight f5, and as it turned out in the game, this wasn't such a great idea after all. After queen g4, the material is even, and black has a little better control over the center, especially considering this e5 square. Most strong grandmasters would prefer to play this position for black, even though the king looks like it's a bit exposed. The bishop on g7 is very strong. The bishop on b3 is not quite that strong. It's actually restricted unless white goes for something crazy like knight f5. So this position would be better for black. Now, after e6, so white goes ahead for this knight f5 crazy idea. So now that's something you guys gotta watch out for, because this is definitely a resource that white's gonna be considering over and over again. Pawn takes on f5, and now queen is welcome to take on g6, which he goes for. Bishop goes to e6, and queen retreats to h5. Now, the situation is such that after knight f5, white had quite a few threats, so taking the knight is definitely a good idea, especially after queen g6, bishop e6. Most of the threats are neutralized. So if white decides to go bishop e6, rook would just take, and if white picks up this pawn right here, then black has this in-between bishop c3 move, pawn takes, and then capture the queen, exchanging the queens, e takes f. Now for a moment it looks like white is doing alright, connecting these pawns right here, However, after rook e3, there's this dangerous g pawn, and these pawns on f5, g5 are actually weaknesses that black is going to be targeting. So this position, black has significant edge. What's cool about it is that as white's been attacking, quite a few pieces been exchanged. So white's attack is not going to be quite that successful, having only 2 or 3 pieces on the board. So black succeeded with his defensive ideas, and now is ready to seize the initiative along with some material. So pawn takes on e4, rook goes to f1, putting pressure on f7, and black comes up with this queen e5 resourceful move. Queen goes into the center, protecting most of the key squares. Rook f7, boom. So here's white comes up with a shot, probably was hoping that this would give him some sort of initiative in the game. Black just captures the bishop right here. What would have been actually stronger is playing rook f8 right here. After rook takes f8, king takes f8, black defended just fine, and having extra pawn right here and this dangerous passers g3 and e3, this position would have been completely winning for white, considering the fact that the pawns are dangerous. However, at the same time, white does have a few tricks, so black would have to watch out for some of those ideas. However, objectively speaking, black has enough resources to defend pretty quick and switch towards the attacking part. So rook f8, as you can see from a conceptual point, okay, another piece gets off the board. This dangerous rook is exchanged for another rook, and black all of a sudden has no problems. Carlsen goes for bishop b3, pawn takes on b3, and he pushes the pawn, which is another good option. King goes to a2. White is getting a bit desperate right here, trying to find some sort of a solution to make a perpetual or create some sort of attacking chances, and make sure his king is right there on a2, safe, relatively safe, since queen a5 is always there. Now queen a5 right here, it probably wouldn't make much sense, because knight goes to a4, and now rook g7 shots with the queen targeting e8, and all kinds of things like queen g6 become a little more annoying. So queen a5 just doesn't make much sense. Now Carlsen gets back to our idea of exchanging those rooks, which is the correct way to go about it. White decides to capture, king takes, and black is going to be trying to queen one of the pawns, or both of them. Queen goes ahead and secures the g3 and attacks the e4. All of a sudden it looks like white may be able to stop the pawns, and maybe even create some counter-attacking ideas like queen c8, maybe pick up the pawn on b7. The main problem right here is that the white's knight cannot move and participate actively neither in the attack nor in the defense, since the b2 is hanging with this g7 and e5 powerful pieces. So black just goes about his business pushing the pawns. g6, and not surprisingly, pawn just goes to e2. Now, as we mentioned, the pawn goes towards queening and distracting the queen from the attacking maneuvers. Now, surprisingly, this move was a big mistake. Okay, if queen e2, queen takes e2, knight takes e2, black pushes g2. Now black wants to play bishop d4, and despite the fact that knight can take it, black is going to be queening, so the bishop is going to be supporting the queen. So white goes ahead and plays c3, defending against bishop d4, and bishop just goes from h6 to e3 and g1. Black is going to be winning that knight, picking up the pawn on g6, and having an extra queen in the extra bishop in the endgame. So this doesn't sound like such a great idea for white. However, here white had a very powerful idea. Queen goes to d7. After queen d7, queen e7, queen c8, queen e8, queen f5, king g8, queen d5, queen f8, king f8, queen f5, king g8, queen goes back and forth right here, and nothing is happening for black. If king decides to go to e7, then white is going to be seizing the initiative, just capturing the pawn for nothing, and probably getting the g pawn as well. So here Carlsen made this mistake that could have cost him a victory in this game. However, Radjabov went for queen f3, king went to e8, queen f7, king d8, queen g8 check, another check, queen came to a7 defending and he kept checking, queen a5 another check, b6, queen d5, so the check stopped. Here we're making another queen, and the king escapes. Had white made another couple checks after this, queen goes here, queen comes right here, queen comes right here. One extra queen is a little much. Knight goes to d5, another check, king goes to e6. So maybe there's some better possibilities for black on the way. However, king states that you got two extra queens, so completely winning situation. Right about here, Radjabov resigned. So white did have some chances, but as we can see, not too many winning chances, but rather chances to make a draw. So this idea of g4 and h5 was interesting, but not quite 100% solid. So in the next game, we're going to look at a similar idea introduced by Karyakin. Before continuing with the next game, I'd like to take a look at the situation and assess this little resource right here, playing e6. So here, a rook pins the bishop, attacking the queen, and bishop captures the queen. So now here, black has a couple interesting ideas, and one of them is a knight d5, and the other is knight f5, which is kind of cool. The rook pins the queen, and now knight blocks the rook that is pinning the queen, and allows for further development of attack. So knight f5 is the one stronger. Rook d6 right here, bishop c6. So if e takes f, then a big disaster happens here. There's bishop f7 stuff, there's rook d7, after bishop f7, king f7, queen g6, king g8, rook d7. Checkmate is coming. So right here, black would go to c6, and white would play actually a very simple positional f takes g, and black would go for a counterattack, playing rook c3, b takes c, queen c3, threatening checkmate, knight exchanges right here, queen takes, and white continues normally, playing bishop e3 with the idea of bishop d4. This position is interesting, just about even chances. Maybe a double edge would be a better way to describe the situation, but those are the possibilities. Now let's look at another way that this idea could be applied. Knight takes f3, knight takes f3, g takes f, queen h5, e6. So in this situation, this would be a bit trickier, since here knight goes to d5, blocks it right there, and black's king is a little more exposed right here in this situation. So after f6, there's several ideas that come into consideration, and especially bishop h6. Here black gets resourceful and plays rook e7, knight captures e7, queen e7, queen g4. So white maintains pressure, however black has an extra pawn, so this would be another one of those double-edged positions, where I would probably prefer white, since white is the one creating trouble for black. So essentially, it's a compensation for a pawn in a way of an open king right there on g8. Here we go. 𝐃𝐫𝐚𝐠𝐨𝐧 Rajabov. Bishop c4, bishop d7, castle, rook c8, bishop b3. As you can see, white really delayed h4. Black plays knight e5, and surprisingly, black goes ahead and continues king b1. So, to let you guys know, there's quite a few options the white has of delaying h4, h5 idea, and maybe even going for g4. So there's more than one way for the move order, and as the move order evolves, there's similar ideas but slightly different details as far as the. Here we go. 𝐃𝐫𝐚𝐠𝐨𝐧 Rajabov. Bishop c4, bishop d7, castle, rook c8, bishop b3. As you can see, white really delayed h4. Black plays knight e5, and surprisingly, black goes ahead and continues king b1. To let you guys know, there's quite a few options the white has of delaying h4, h5 idea, and maybe even going for g4. So there's more than one way for the move order, and as the move order evolves, there's similar ideas, but here black decides to play a6, and it sounds like this would be a position to go for a sacrifice. The thing with b5, though, either one of the knights captures, and white's king is so solid with that bishop right there, and there's two knights right here, queen, bishop. It's really, the queen side is not going to be quite as vulnerable as it would generally be in Sicilian situations and in many other situations where b5 would be a little more successful. In this position, black gets a very, very little compensation. So a6 is a legitimate move. White finally goes for h4. h5, this is the move I would definitely recommend for you guys to study in depth in different situations, where actually h4, h5, and studying the consequence of this g4 shot and other positional ideas, starting with bishop g5 and rook he1, which may seem surprising to you guys. Rook he1, and then the idea of maybe adjusting the queen and going for f4, e5 break, as opposed to trying to break the king side. So there's quite a few different approaches and different ways to approach each one of those setups. So here, g4. So 𝐃𝐫𝐚𝐠𝐨𝐧 goes for this brave g4 idea. Pawn takes on g4, and he pushes h5. Knight h5. And here you guys would expect rook h5 once again. The only challenge, though, is that the bishop on e3 is not quite as active as the bishop on g5. Bishop on g5 really adds the flavor to that attack, since defensive mechanism is blocked, the e6 is blocked, and there's more shots, more attacking ideas having the bishop on g5, including the knight d5 move. So here rook h5 is not quite that strong, or maybe even legitimate. So here rook g1 comes handy. So here rook g1 puts a lot of pressure right here on g4, and it's not like white has created a big threat. However, considering that white is about to play bishop h6 and possibly have the ideas of f4, f5 ready, it just rook g1 just adds to the strength of the attack rather than creating a threat. Queen goes to a5, and black is ready to go for our favorite counter-attacking move, bishop h6, and here black uses one of the ideas we mentioned earlier in a slightly different way. Black bishop goes to f6. So here, this is the deal. It's not always that bishop h8 type stuff is practical. In this position, it's actually very practical, since that bishop is key to the defense of the king side. And after bishop f6, Okay, take the rook on f8, but don't try to get my bishop on f6. So white goes ahead and takes on g4, having in mind the fact that he can capture on f8 later on. Bishop g4. Now 𝐾𝐫𝐚𝐠𝐸 goes for the rook, and king takes the bishop. And what's interesting, it's not the rook, but the king takes the bishop. And what's cool about it is that king is moving towards the center and the queen side to escape from this powerful attack. And now materially, black is doing very well. And positionally, having that knight on e5 and having just this big control over the center makes black's position favorable. What would be really cool for black to do is exchange the queens. Once the queens get off the board in this type of situations, this endgame is just going to be very comfortable for black. Queen goes to e3, and here we go. Rook captures on c3. e6 was a reasonable option for black to pursue. e6 blocks that bishop on b3, restricts this knight from going to d5, really establishes good control over the center. Black decides to go for rook c3, which is irresistible. You definitely want to do that. Okay, the knight is active. Okay, e6 would serve a similar purpose. Or here, rook c3 just creates a massive advantage for black in terms of restricting white's options. White has a choice between taking with the b pawn and taking with the queen. If white decides to take with the b pawn, the game, black doesn't have any shocking tactical strikes. Probably just continues positionally playing queen c5 and just having good control over the game, and at the best opportunity exchange the queens or maneuver the pieces towards safer spot in regards to the king, or towards more active spots, the spots where the pieces can be more active, or could be restricting the opponent's pieces. So in this case, definitely black's position is preferable. In terms of just raw advantage, okay, white has two extra exchanges for two pawns essentially, but black's pieces are much better, and black's pawn structure is the famous dragon. So here, b takes c, queen c5, definitely a good compensation. 𝐾𝐫𝐚 goes ahead and captures with the queen, going for the endgame, and black plays the rest of the game in a phenomenal style. Queen captures, exchange the pawns. e6 is very logical, because the bishop was about to go to d5 and start attacking those queenside pawns, which wouldn't be a big deal since bishop c8 would defend it really well. However, black is proactive, just playing e6. Bishop c4, a tricky idea where knight cannot take the bishop. The bishop on b3. e6 really restricts the bishop right there. Now, generally in dragon, e6 is just not a very good idea because it weakens the d6 while having all the pieces on board in the middle game stages. However, here, e6 is a really cool, useful move restricting the bishop in the endgame. So bishop goes to c4. White really tries to maneuver the bishop out of there, play bishop e2, exchange one of the pieces, maybe loosen black's control a little bit. The thing with the rooks really like open files, and here white doesn't have too many open files. But let's go through the game kind of quick so we have a little more time for the opening part of the games. So bishop c4, knight captures, rook captures on g4, bishop improves the position, goes to e5. Now this prepares the knight to jump to f6, rook g2, b5 fixes that weakness on the a2 and secures the position for the knight on c4. Rook f2, white finally locates a target on e6, f7, rook f1, and consolidates. Looks like white is just about to take the game under control, and king goes to g8. Here, black had a very resourceful idea playing knight f6. Rook hf1, and then king goes to g7. Not king e7, since here knight c6, but king g7. And after knight c6, black would have this tricky knight e3 move, which wasn't obvious to notice, and getting significant advantage right here. Boom, getting one of the exchanges back, just winning edge for black. So black decided to be a little cautious and white went for a break on the queen side. So black just took, gaining that passed pawn. Now the e4 weakness right there. And d5, powerful d5. Finally, black is strong enough to get really aggressive. Rook h3, cool Karpovian idea. Rook is defending horizontally the pawn on c3. Bishop captures. This is interesting. Bishop is obviously much stronger than the knight, but the knight gets really comfortable right there, and it's easier to push the pawns. And there is a fork as well, which is good for black. 𝐾𝐫 takes the pawns pushing, and knight remaneuvers. So white is just about ready to get the pawn going. However, black is going to be faster. Black is improving the king and pretty much stopping those pawns right there. King c7. So black managed to win this game. So now let's do a little summary of what we learned today. We started off looking at the classic examples, the games of 𝐶𝐫𝐚 against Panov and Althausen. So the first game demonstrated us the power of the dragon bishop, which was illustrated in terms of the idea of bishop h6, trying to exchange the bishops, and the decline of that idea by bishop h8, right here in the spot, bishop h6, bishop h8. Then we realized that actually here, bishop h8 is an interesting idea, but bishop takes h6, queen takes h6, rook c3, b takes c, brings us even stronger attack. So the idea of bishop h8, the idea of sacrificing that f8 rook, actually came up at least once in our later analysis, and the idea of rook c3 we saw in almost every one of the games that we analyzed. Then we continued on to take a look at a great example of white's attacking capabilities, where Karpov used this knight e2 idea and went for this amazing attack, which culminated at 24 e5, where all the pieces came together to deliver the final strike. Lastly, we took a look at the idea of h5 for black against h4, rook c5, white's prophylaxis, black's prophylaxis, and this g4 powerful strike, which, as it turns out, black has very good counterplay against, where the position gets pretty unbalanced after g4 and h5. However, if you guys have it all very well analyzed and familiar with the latest examples, you're going to be perfectly fine. The last game was a cool collection of the topical ideas that we examined. Bishop f6, sacrificing that exchange right there, bishop f8, a king escapes through the center, and then we have this powerful sacrifice, and we realize that a lot of these endgames are going to be great for black. It was awesome to analyze the dragon variation games with you guys today. Looking forward to speak to you soon.